going to turn off my mic now and I'm going to be signing through my presentation. So Tracy is going to voice over for me.
Okay. Hello everybody, you're very welcome to my presentation. My presentation is about my recent research, an undergraduate research in Trinity College Dublin, and it's talking about the experience of deaf students using an interpreter in education. It's just a small piece of research, but really we've found a lot of interesting information. I feel like it would be appropriate for a PhD topic, but it was too late by the time that I had realised. So today I just want to give you a little bit of the background in relation to interpreting in Ireland and the training involved. Equally, I want to talk about the students' experience learning through interpreters. I want to talk about what the difference is between direct learning and mediated learning, the two different approaches. And then equally, I want to kind of delve a little bit more into my research. And then I will talk about the conclusion and the next steps. It was from the signing, the noise of the bracelet, sorry, that was the interpreter's request. So I just want to ask everybody here a question, whether it be here in Ireland, if you're here from Ireland or from your own country. Does anybody know anything about sign language? Hands up, any knowledge of sign language? Okay, so there's a few. Do you know the answer to this question? If you do, just raise your hand. Is sign language a direct translation from spoken language? Is it word for word? You think it's a direct translation? No. Okay, the opposite. Okay. Okay, so sign language is different to spoken language. It has its own structure, its own grammar. Sign language is a visual language. It uses different modalities. It's a rich language that's used all over the world. And I just want to let you know that for each individual country, they have their own sign language. It's not the same all over the world. So just so that you're aware of that if you didn't know already. So today, the focus for the conference is UDL, Universal Design Learning. And in your bag, it talks about the user pyramid. And so this is designed teaching for the majority of your students. And at the top of that pyramid, it talks about people who have specific needs. So in relation to the deaf community and sign language users, they would be appropriately placed at the top of that pyramid using interpreters. And so for the UDL, I suppose kind of, frame of mind, you need to have deaf people at the top of that pyramid. So just to inform you, give you a little bit of information in relation to the Irish context, there's a very low percentage of deaf and hard of people attending the higher education. The census back in 2011 said that there was 1.2% of people who attained a third level qualification. And so they were deaf or hearing impaired. And that's an extremely low percentage. Research from Lorraine Leeson, she said that deaf people are 10 times likely to attain a third level qualification. Here in Ireland, there's very little research in relation to deaf people in education, but I did find two pieces of research. One from Pat Matthews back in 1996, and then another one from Conema and Grahan in 2002. And they both documented that it was a very low percentage of deaf and hard of hearing people attending third level education. There were 31 deaf interviews within this research, and one person went to attended third level education. Equally, the Higher Education Authority had some concerns in relation to this low number of both blind and deaf people accessing third level education. They published a national access plan, and they wanted to target deaf people entering third level education because they were concerned that the percentage was so low. AHEAD carried out some research back in 2000 and have been doing so since 2008, and the number is on the increase, but in comparison to the percentage of people with disabilities, the actual percentage rate is going down. So in 2008, there was 4.6% of students with disabilities attending higher education, and now it's just 2.7%. And although the numbers have increased, the percentages have gone down. Here in Ireland, the training for interpreters, we have over 100 interpreters who have been trained. The Centre for Deaf Studies was established back in 2001. So from 2003 onwards, we've had continuous training for interpreters. The numbers are increasing, but we only have about 4 or 5 graduating on average a year, so the numbers are still very low. We have over 100 interpreters trained, like I said, but only 75 to 80 of those are working, and not all of them would be working on a full-time basis. So I'd like to talk about the experience of learning through an interpreter. For a deaf person, in terms of their academic achievement, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. The academic preparation, if they're prepared for the road ahead in terms of the college experience. Social adjustment, how they fit in, and is it easy for them to socially make friends. Classroom participation. Often if there's classroom discussions, would the deaf person have the confidence to engage in the group work or to ask questions? And then equally, what kind of access they have to supports, not only just interpreters but also note takers. In Ireland, we have funding for students with disabilities, and so you can go to the disability officer and look for support, whether that be an interpreter. The interpreters are only provided for academic contact hours, which means it's only the lectures where the interpreter is provided. You're not guaranteed to have an interpreter for social access, for tutorials, for training, personal development courses. There's no guarantee that you would have funding for that access, which obviously affects the academic attainment for the deaf student. Research states that if the quality of interpretation is poor, or this can equally affect the academic attainment. And so if you have a good quality interpreter and good access, then you have a positive experience. And I suppose that kind of has a domino effect then on your experience within college. So again, going back to the term of direct and mediated approaches. Direct learning means that an individual is learning through a common language, and so therefore their learning is direct. Mediated learning is where you're learning through a third party. So for example, you're all here today and you are now experiencing mediated learning via the interpreter. So you don't know the same language as myself, and so therefore you're not getting the full overall I suppose kind of picture. There's I suppose 3 people here who understand sign language, the 2 interpreters and then my deaf colleague, so they would be getting direct learning. So just to ask you a question, what do you know, like let's say for example, if a person was experiencing direct learning, what percentage would they be, what percentage of learning would they have? Can we have a guess? Up to 100%. Possibly any other comments in relation to that? 80%? Okay, yeah, you're right. 80 to 85% via direct learning. What about mediated learning? What percentage would you suggest? 50 to 60%? Yeah, in and around, yeah, you're close. So this is specifically talking about deaf people accessing education via interpreters. It's not in relation to spoken language interpreting. So direct learning is 80 to 85%, and then mediated learning 60 to 65%. That's a big difference. And I'll explain why. So a lot of research, and I've read through a lot of stuff, but in terms of classroom discourse, it's an inadequate representation of what's happening in the classroom because of many different reasons. You have a time delay, topic changes, rapidly, different speakers speaking at different times. It's hard to interpret for, the same individual or different individuals at the same time. Let's say, for example, different accents, different tones within people's voices. There's a lot of, I suppose, kind of mitigating factors. In relation to the subject and educational knowledge, like let's say, for example, if an interpreter was interpreting for a science lecture, do they have the knowledge required in order to interpret that appropriately? If they understand science, they have a background. They have background knowledge, they're familiar with terminology, and would be able to interpret it more appropriately. If an interpreter who has already attended college has achieved a degree in something different to interpreting, it means that the interpreter has an understanding of the academic knowledge in terms of a specific subject. They have experience, and I suppose that can influence how they interpret. For example, if you talk about an interpreter and I suppose in their brain they have a certain dictionary for sign language, and then they go in to interpret a lecture, and sometimes a certain word that they would use a specific sign for, it wouldn't be exactly what that sign should have been used for, and so therefore it wouldn't have been an appropriate translation. And this research states that, this comes up in studies. One student who responded to my questionnaire said that they were studying accountancy. The interpreter signed the term invoice. That's a compound word, in and voice. And so there's two signs. You could sign in, and then you could sign voice. But invoice, it's not in your voice. That's not what that word means. So what should have been used was a fingerspelled term, and then the visual picture of what an invoice looks like. But the person who responded to my question said that the interpreter actually signed in and voice, which was not an appropriate translation and not the right context to be using those signs, which led to confusion and misunderstanding. So you can just see how much of an impact that can have. Now the boring part is out of the way. And so now I'm moving on to talk about my research findings. I suppose my research target was deaf people who attended university from 2005 to 2015, both users of users of ISL and interpreters. I had a confidential, an anonymous questionnaire used online, and there were 3 different sections. We talked about availability of interpreters, quality and understanding of interpreters, and general feedback and comments. I had 31 people respond to my research, which I thought was very good. I was only expecting about 12 to 15, so that was fantastic. I only used 27 for comparisons because one person mentioned that they were in college before 2005, so I needed to remove them. And then others said that they had decided not to use an ISL interpreter because they preferred to use a note taker. So out of the 31, I was able to use 27 for comparison and analysis. 24 people mentioned that they had never used an Irish Sign Language interpreter prior to entering university. And this is an important factor because if you look at situations in the US, they've used interpreters from primary school right through to higher education. So they know the importance of working with an interpreter. They know the do's and don'ts. They know the importance of the relationship and how to interact with each other. If you've never used an interpreter before attending college, you're not sure of what it is that you're allowed or not allowed to do. You're not sure of your boundaries. And I think that that's important to mention within this research. Maybe this is the first time that some students have used an Irish Sign Language interpreter. 25 had said that they met with the disability officer to discuss their needs in relation to an interpreter. The first question was asking how often deaf students had used an interpreter. 7 people said that they only needed ISL interpreters for some of their modules. The other 20 people said that they needed the interpreter for all modules. I think that that shows that everyone did use an interpreter. Access wasn't the issue. They used ISL for some modules, and remember I mentioned earlier on, some modules they didn't need an interpreter because they may have partaken in lab work, or it was a practical classroom, so they didn't need an interpreter. So some said that they only used it for certain modules, so I assume that that was the case of why they didn't use them. I asked the question of how many different ISL interpreters did you have throughout your course? And, 46%, is it 46? Sorry, 48% said that they used between 1 and 3 interpreters throughout their course. 33% said that they used probably 4 to 6 different interpreters throughout their course. And then 19% said that they used more than 6 interpreters throughout the course. That's a significant question, and the reason I asked is because I know from my research the importance of building a relationship and a trust with the interpreter. And so that's why I asked that question, to see how many different interpreters that the students had to use. The good thing is that most students were using in and around 1 to 3 interpreters. The next question I asked was, did they have a regular interpreter and not having to use a different interpreter every single day or every lecture? And again, the majority, 85%, said that yes, they had regular interpreters for their course. 11% said that they only had a regular interpreter for specific modules. And then 1 person said that they never had a regular interpreter. The next question I asked was about the importance of having a regular interpreter, and did students feel that that was important, and if they did, could they explain why? 25% said that it was crucial that they have a regular interpreter. 2 said that they didn't feel that it was because they didn't have a choice, they couldn't change it. There was nothing that they could do in relation to that. So maybe, I think, they said no because there was no other option for them to click on the survey. When I asked them to explain why, there was a lot of overlapping comments. Again, they talked about the familiarity with the course and the background knowledge of the subject. It meant that there was less of a time delay because the interpreter knew the layout of the classroom, student names, prior knowledge from previous lectures, which meant that the interpreter could keep pace a lot easier. They also spoke about the importance of building a relationship and a trust between the student and the interpreter. They could represent the student more appropriately if they were asking questions. If the student didn't know the interpreter, they would be less likely to ask a question because they're not sure if the interpreter would represent them correctly when voicing them over. Students also spoke about the importance of creating subject-specific terminology within the classroom. Some signs wouldn't be, I suppose, fully developed in spoken language. In terms of, say, a scientific language, there wouldn't be specific signs for certain English words within signs. So the student and the interpreter would agree a specific sign to use within that classroom, not necessarily out within the community. So these are some quotes from some of the students. So one student said, "Yes, my course used specific language that the consistent interpreters would know. A new interpreter might struggle with some terminology." Another quote was, "It really helped me using the same interpreter. We agreed on common signs early on. This saved having to explain again and again to new interpreters." And then the third one, "We have created our own signs for the content in the module that would not be used outside." These are just some quotes from student responses. So moving on to talk about punctuality or non-attendance. Let's say, for example, if an interpreter didn't attend, I asked the students what would they do and how would they deal with that. The majority of the students said that it was fine, that if there was any issue they would find a replacement, which is a good outcome. If there was an issue, then they would report it to their disability or access officer. Sometimes they would directly send the interpreter a text to ask them where they were and how come they hadn't attended. If they knew, the student knew that the interpreter wasn't going to attend, if the interpreter sent the message to say that there was an emergency and they weren't able to attend, the deaf person would then decide to stay at home and not go into the lecture. There's no point because they would have no access. And again, that can affect their academic attainment because they're not going to lectures, missing out on lectures because they don't have an interpreter. And again, you can see how this would affect them when getting ready for studying for an exam. If the student was unaware that the interpreter was not going to attend the lecture, oftentimes they found themselves sitting in a classroom waiting for the interpreter to attend. The lecturer has now arrived and the deaf person feels that they have to stay in the lecture until there was an appropriate natural break where they could leave. And again, we have some more quotes from some students. And just to explain here, these asterisks beside the quotes, I did have to adjust the grammar on these quotes somewhat. Some deaf people, I suppose their grammar wasn't, correct, and so I had to just make some tweaks to them. So that's what those asterisks are. Sometimes I found out in the class, meaning I was stuck throughout the class with no clue of what the lecture was on about. Then if it was a question time or group discussion, it was even more awkward for me with no idea. A replacement came 40 minutes late. They forgot about it until I texted them. Of course I was embarrassed, but I stayed. And then the third one is, twice I experienced interpreters arriving 45 minutes late. I stayed on and missed out on everything for the first 45 minutes. And one of them was a walking debate within the class. Embarrassing. I found it interesting that there were 3 different people who used the term awkward or embarrassing. So there's kind of like a negative feeling linked to those words. And that can have an impact on deaf people's social experience. They feel isolated, they feel embarrassed, and they don't want to, I suppose, put themselves into a position like that again. And some find themselves then, as a result, withdrawing from college. The next question focused on interpretation, quality and understanding. And I suppose there were many different statements in relation to the interpretation quality. So I asked them to rate these, the answers to their questions on a scale of 1 to 10. I don't have time to go through them all today, but I have my presentation slides and I can email them to you if you wanted to read them in more detail. But I just want to give you a quick look. The majority of these statements said that the interpreter was good. There wasn't one statement where, over 50% was excellent. On average, you know what I mean, they were saying that the interpreters were good. The next question I asked the students how they felt or what they felt was the most important relationship when working with an interpreter. There was 5 different phrases or 5 different attributes that the survey focused on. And I asked them to arrange in numerical order which they felt was most important. The results, number 1, the first most important attribute was trust and confidentiality. The second was fluency of ISL and their signing skills. The third was reliability. And the fourth was being able to cope or being able to choose their preferred interpreter. And then the fifth was having access regardless of the quality. It's interesting to see that because it shows now deaf people attending college over 27 deaf people from the research over the years. They felt that the most important attribute was trust and confidentiality with the interpreter that they were working with. It's not about access anymore. I think previous research was focusing on access and the barriers that deaf students face. The focus is now changing to trust and confidentiality and the relationship. And the last question, was just in relation to general comments and feedback in terms of their experience using an interpreter. A lot of the responses, students felt that they were fortunate. Equally, they felt that they were well able to recognise the difference between a newly qualified and a very experienced interpreter. I also asked the participants, did they have an opportunity to review their experience of working with interpreters in the university, and nearly half of the students said they didn't have an opportunity to feed that back to the disability office. They would have liked the opportunity. They never thought about it, and they never thought about meeting the disability or access officer to give that feedback back to them. They felt that if there were any issues, they felt that the disability or access officer was responsible to resolve those issues. And yet, I think there wasn't a lot of awareness or understanding about the skill set of interpreters and why they were picking certain interpreters. I don't think that the disability officers were aware of these issues. 2 respondents said that they had approached the disability officer in relation to certain issues that they faced, and the disability officer passed it on to the interpreter and revealed the identity of who it was that had passed on that complaint, which I suppose kind of brings about that kind of bad feeling or awkwardness throughout the rest of the semester. And they're the exact words that were used by the respondents: bad feelings and awkwardness. Again, affecting the social environment of the student and affecting their ability to be included. I asked the respondents if they could give me 3 pieces of advice if they could go back again, starting their educational experience again. What would they suggest? And there's a lot of overlap. They said that they would like to have regular interpreters. They would also like to have an opportunity to regularly feed back to the disability officer, whether it be with the interpreting agency or with the disability officer. They also mentioned the fact that in an ideal world, they would like to meet with the interpreter beforehand, in a way trying to, I suppose, kind of agree on the appropriate language, appropriate, I suppose, kind of ground rules for the relationship. Text me if you're not going to be available, and so on. So another said that they would like to have a preference or a list of interpreters who they would prefer to work with. And then some said that they would like to have a second interpreter or a backup interpreter per se. If you're using just one interpreter all day long, the processing, I suppose, kind of ability needed for a full day, each interpreter would need to switch back and forth. So they felt that they would need 2 interpreters for certain, I suppose, days if there was full days of lectures. Gone too quickly there, sorry. So to conclude, my research clearly states that there are a threefold increase of deaf ISL users attending higher education. Access is not the major issue. It's more focusing on trust and the relationship between the interpreter and the deaf student. It's imperative that the interpreter communicates clearly with the deaf student if there is going to be a difficulty with them attending. And from research, it looks like all stakeholders need to be trained. The disability officers, the agencies, and the deaf students. All three need to be trained in terms of how to use an interpreter, what the expectations are, appropriate boundaries between interpreters and students, and a complaints process if there is an issue. So there needs to be some kind of a guide for all stakeholders. The importance of having a regular interpreter so that they have that subject-based knowledge. A lot of the responders feel that there's a lot of value in being able to create your own subject-specific sign, and therefore having a regular interpreter really enhances that experience. And then lastly, trust, in terms of trust leads to an effective working relationship. Thank you very much.